Today on the Ferment Station, let's talk about the history of mead, the world's oldest alcohol. Welcome to the Ferment Station. This is the podcast for the City Studying Brews YouTube channel. I'm Brian.
I'm Derica, and today we're uncorking the rich and honey-sweet history of mead.
All right, we have a lot of notes here, and I don't want to say anything wrong. So if you see me looking down, well, this is a podcast. You should be listening anyway. So the first thing we have here is from Viking feasts to ancient Chinese tombs, mead has been sipped, praised, and even mythologized. Mythologized? Is that really a word?
Mythologized?
That's not what it says. It says mythologized. Mythologized. Wow, it's even more. But why did it nearly disappear? And why is it making a comeback today? So we're going to cover a lot of things in this video.
We have references for all the stuff we're talking about. I will have links.
For all the technically...
links in the description below.
And actually reading the notes for this inspired me to come up with a recipe for a new mead that will be fantasy theme inspired.
Which we really enjoy doing that on City Studying Brews.
But it has to make sense. I don't like to do those things just be like, I'm not going to say, oh, it's green, so it's Hulk mead. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
That doesn't work for me. It's got to have some semblance of reality in the fantasy that it's in. Yeah, that makes sense. You know what I mean?
So to start off, let's give you a brief introduction into what is mead.
Mead is fermented honey in an alcoholic beverage, but we actually have a real definition. Alcoholic beverage made from fermented honey, water, and sometimes fruit, herbs, or spices. Now, I know we did a video where we talked about the different types of mead.
We did a deep dive, if you want to call it that. It was even just like just off the top dive. It wasn't even a deep dive because there's so much more to it than
there's
that.
a lot. Now, the funny thing is mead is that definition, but that's not the only definition for mead, and it's not the only definition for fermented honey. It gets so confusing, and there's so much to it.
It depends a lot about where you are in the world, your specific culture, government regulations. There's so much more involved.
Here's a perfect, for instance, just in the United States. Two Warriors Meadery. Curtis has told me if they make just what's called a traditional or a straight mead, where it's just mead or honey water yeast, he can call it mead. If he adds fruit, now he has to call it honey wine. Yet we got stuff from Superstition Meadery out in Arizona that is obviously not just honey, water, and yeast, and it says mead right on the bottle. So even within different states in the United States, the definition of mead varies. So that's where the definition of what the beverage is and the government definition may be different. And that's where each jurisdiction may be slightly different. We talked about that in the other video. I don't want to go too far into it, but that's the gist.
And I'll make sure to link that deeper discussion of mead specifically in the description below.
Now, mead often ranges in ABV, okay, and this is part of the definition. The notes here say 5 to 20%. It's more like 3 to 18, really. There are some that are higher, but in general, they're like 3 to 15. Even those Polish meads that everybody makes a big deal about that have tons of honey, they're really only about 15% or 16% ABV. Normally. They can be more, but normally they are only about that high. They are very, very sweet, but they're mellowed over a long period of time. So that's where that comes from. Just a little extra side note there.
Lots of times when we throw out the word mead, people instantly feel or think about the Vikings.
Yep.
And with popular culture and the word mead or mjod, if I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but I was trying to do it
that's pretty right.
You think of Vikings because that's where that term originated. But looking back into history of fermented honey beverages.
Can I do the line? Can I do the line?
Sure.
Mead itself is older than the word mead.
Yeah. Yeah.
Way older than the word mead.
So basically, if there's humans and there's honey, there's probably a mead-like beverage. And so part of the difficulty of dating foodstuffs,
besides the fact that it's, you got to talk to their parents to pick them up. Sorry, had to do it.
Putting a timestamp on foodstuffs is that humans, their technology...
You didn't always write it down.
advanced along with them, but they were still eating and drinking stuff even before they had the technology. So if you don't have a document that has survived the time and you don't have a vessel that has survived that period of time, then you don't have an official record for when the first thing occurred.
Yeah, and that's one thing that comes up a lot. We hear this a lot, that people will say that beer is the oldest fermented beverage. I'm going to talk more about this in a little while, but I don't see any way that it can be. And I'll explain more later, because let's talk about some of the stuff that's been found about mead. This isn't really a comparison of mead versus beer, but it's going to come up.
So the oldest evidence
in China
of mead was in China, 7,000 BCE.
So that's like 9,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Because we're in the 2000s now. So about 9,000 years ago. So that's not the oldest that I've ever heard of, but that's the oldest in China. And that's evidence.
That's the oldest physical evidence.
Right, exactly. The oldest physical evidence of it.
So there were So there were pottery shards from Jahu. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Jahu?
Probably. Maybe.
Site show residue of honey, rice, and fruit. So that's the earliest chemical evidence of a mead-like beverage.
Now, that's interesting, too, because it says honey, rice, and fruit. Recently, a couple people have asked on our rice wine video if we could do a mead rice wine hybrid. And I always kind of go, do they really go together? Well, apparently the ancient Chinese thought so.
Yeah.
So maybe that's something worth looking at. By the way, we do have references for all this information, and we will put them in the description below. But this is from Patrick McGovern on Ancient Wine, The Search for Origins of Viniculture from Princeton University Press, 2003.
Yep. So the next one is more of a logical synopsis of the origin of a honey fermented vessel, and that's just based on human development.
Right, and it's from Africa, honey hunting and wild fermentation. Indigenous honey wines like Tej are still very popular in Ethiopia today and all over Africa, I think. Yeah. But this says specifically Ethiopia. I think Tej is specifically Ethiopian. They probably have different names for different things.
Yeah. And that's because spontaneous fermentation likely discovered through honey left in rainwater. So logic dictates that a fermented honey or fermented fruit would have been the first fermented beverage that humans came across, because it just happens.
But it's also, if you think about it from this perspective, spontaneous fermentation is what they're talking about. So spontaneous fermentation means it happened without human intervention.
Right.
Which means anywhere there's bees that are making honey, this could have happened at any time period, anywhere on the planet.
And a person just happened to walk by and
drink it.
Drank some and said, "Ooh, I feel funny."
There's a lot of ways it can happen too, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But mead was possibly discovered among the first humans in Africa 20,000 to 40,000 years ago. So that means the first humans.
Yeah.
First humans were making mead. They had mead or ability,
consuming
access
mead
to it in some way. They might have found it naturally rather than making it, but that means it is the oldest because it's as old as people, which means it's probably older than people.
Yeah.
If the bees are older than people, the mead is older than people.
It's possible that dinosaurs were chugging.
Dinosaurs could have been getting drunk on mead. I have a T-shirt about that. But it says the dinosaurs had no mead, and we all know how that turned out.
Well,
but maybe they did have mead. It is possible.
Bees that were making honey.
That's right, and they found the beehive. They might have done it. Yeah. You never know. It is a possibility. But this is before agriculture and ceramic pottery was even a thing.
Right. So therefore, there's going to be no physical evidence left for us to discover and put a time date on that. So it's more of a if-then clause and logic rather than actual physical evidence.
Well, here's what the reference actually says. Due to the prevalence of naturally occurring fermentation and the distribution of eusocial honey-producing insects, that's like bees, wasps, and ants. They have a high social order based off of like somewhat of an intelligence as a hive mind kind of thing. Worldwide, as a result, it's hard to pinpoint the exact historical origin of mead given the possibility of multiple discovery or potential knowledge transfer between early humans prior to recorded history.
Now, we've seen this in other things through study of human evolution where different pockets all over the world share a common technology.
Right.
Be it a food.
Stone crafting.
Or stone crafting or weapons or whatever.
Yeah. Like the bow and arrow. It's been reinvented in like almost every culture.
Sure. So
they didn't share it necessarily. Some did. But every culture formed their own version of it.
So basically what they're suggesting here is if you have humans and you have bees making honey,
you probably had mead.
You probably had a mead-like substance.
Yeah, that's not an actual scientific find, but that is a logical conclusion. And by the way, the reference for that is John P. Arnold from Origin and History of Beer and Brewing from 2005. Mead mentioned in early Indo-European mythologies. Barry Cavash Mead Hall, Feasting in Anglo-Saxon Society. It's from an anthropological study. So
yeah. There are tons of literal works that reference mead throughout the years. It seems like as soon as man learned to write, they started writing about mead.
But I want to point something out, that the word mead is a Norse term, okay? Other countries didn't call it that. Other cultures didn't call it that. And at the time that people were discovering mead and making mead for thousands of years, Europe was not called Europe. It wasn't a thing. People didn't live there yet when mead was already created. So to think that mead is a Viking thing, it's not. They adopted something that already existed. I'm not taking any renown away from them. They may have perfected it. They may be most famous for it. They may be prolific in the making of it, but they didn't invent it.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing. They didn't invent it. I want to talk about now why I believe that mead may be the oldest beverage.
And this was something that was hinted in when we went to Africa. So they talked about spontaneous fermentation.
Let me start with beer, though. To make beer, you have to have the grain. Now, it is entirely possible the grain grew wild. However, we know that almost all grain started out as grass and had really not great production value. Like not a lot of volume was coming from it because it was grass. It's the seeds of grass, right? So first, you're going to have to collect a lot of it, which is probably not as likely to happen except for food. Then you have to heat it to a certain temperature to get the amylase enzyme to counteract and turn the starches into sugars that can then be fermented. So it won't ferment just spontaneously on its own. And on top of that, now you've heated it. You had to heat it past the temperature that would be considered pasteurization, which means any wild yeast that were on it, you killed them. Which means I am going to sit here, whatever, and say that I cannot possibly fathom a way that beer was made before mead because of the human interaction effect. Humans had to do something, and they had to do quite a bit. Remember when we said earlier that mead was around before agriculture, which means that's before we were actually cultivating barley into what is now barley, which means there's about no way. Now let's talk about wine. Wine could have been from, they found fruit that had fallen and it started to rot a little bit. It fermented. The wild yeast started fermenting it. Somebody ate it or they saw an animal eat it and saw them acting kind of funny. So they started collecting this fruit and that got them drunk. Now it's possible that animals did this first and humans copied it. But here's the thing. If you don't get it at just the right time or collect it or keep it in some way, it's just going to rot and be no good for anybody because mold and all this other stuff starts to form. So that requires a little bit, just a step of intervention to make that palatable and usable. Whereas mead, there's a couple ways this could happen. We know a guy who collected honey from a hive that had already fermented and turned to vinegar. So it went past, it got spoiled into vinegar.
It was the best tasting vinegar.
It was amazing
ever.
vinegar. But he also told me of, and we've heard about, hives that got broken or damaged in a storm by wind or a tree breaking or things like that. And water got in and the honey with wild yeast in it starts to ferment. Now, that happened without a human having to do a thing other than try to collect that honey, drink some of it, which was probably super sweet, but it probably had some alcohol in it, and go, whoa, this is different. I like this. Let me get more. Now they are collecting it. They may have actively just collected it for a long, long time, but it could go another way too. Humans have been eating honey for a long, long time. Let's say you had a bucket and there was a little bit of honey in the bottom. You want to get it all out, so you add a little bit of water. Let's say you let that sit for a few days. Now you've just diluted it, and the wild yeast in that honey could start fermenting. When you go to consume that, you have mead. So
Yeah.
it's so much more likely.
The process of nature taking over and instructing humans how to
Right.
make mead is so much more logical than the process of nature teaching humans how to make beer. Now, I did read an article. I didn't include it in this talk because we're focusing on mead, of where they did find evidence of an ancient beer. And the concept of how it came about is that they were boiling grains to make
Okay.
like a gruel type
Sure.
situation.
And that is probably the way it happened.
And then
They let it sit.
They just let it sit. And then, ta-da.
The only way that could happen is if wild yeast was somehow reintroduced to the batch,
Right.
which could totally happen. If you're making breads and things like that and you have wild yeast in the air, it is entirely possible that could happen. But even then, think about it. They had to have agriculture to get that much grains in order to boil them.
Right.
We're talking mead was consumed before they were growing
Sure.
the grains.
The process of cooking or preparing food prior to consuming it
Yep.
is farther down in the history of humans than just hunting and gathering.
Right. Yeah.
So you can gather the spontaneously fermented honey before you're going to be cooking grains to make
Absolutely. And all this just still leads to, I believe, mead came first. Wine was probably right around the same time or a little bit further on because it took a little bit more to do and it wouldn't have been considered a drink. It was probably a food.
Well,
Actually, I bet you mead was too. You were eating
yeah.
you were eating alcoholic honey.
Now, I
really.
have witnessed birds
Yep.
that specifically
will
waited
do it on purpose.
for like a date palm or something to go south, and they will eat those
Yep.
drunken berries like crazy.
Yep.
And it's actually quite amusing to watch. So it is possible that humans witnessed
Mm-hmm.
that behavior and curiosity got the best of them, and they wanted to know, well, why are those birds so crazy?
So-
and they may have sampled the drunken fruit.
Yeah. So is it safe to say that humans didn't even invent the alcohol? That
Yeah.
animals did.
It's a spontaneous
Yeah, it's a
occurring
spontaneous
thing.
occurring thing. So we didn't invent
Mother
it. We
Nature
discovered
invented
it. I would say
We're
humans
just enjoying the fruits of her labor.
Yeah, we discovered it because it was already there. We just didn't know about it yet. This is where this stuff gets super interesting because I have heard many people say that mead's only a few thousand years old, and I'm like, no, there's just no way. I mean, fermentation's been around for a long, long time, whether we were doing it on purpose or not, and this is further proof that, 40,000 years, that's like the dawn of humanity. Any further beyond that, there really weren't people yet. But I'm thinking even before we were human beings, when we were like there's a lot of human variants that were around. Well, not human. There was a lot of, there's a word for it that I can't think of.
He's talking about the pre-human.
Yeah.
That's another topic for a different channel.
But they were probably drinking mead back then,
sure.
even before humans.
Sure.
See, mead is old,
if
man.
the birds can do it, why can't?
Birds do it.
Mammals.
Bees do it.
All right, so let's move forward on mead and myth, legend, and culture. And we're going to start with your friends and ours, the Norse.
Yep. And this is pretty much where mead became a common word today, was from Norse mythology, because before then it was mentioned, but it wasn't as major of a deal. The Norse had it, mead of poetry, magical mead created from the blood of Kvasir. And then you have the belief that warriors in Valhalla drank mead from the udder of a goat named Helorun.
Hedrun, I think.
We'll go with that because I don't. My Old Norse is kind of rusty.
Maybe it's Hedrun.
Yeah, let's go with that. We'll put the notes. The reference for this is from John Lindow, Norse Mythology: A Guide to Gods, Heroes, Rituals, and Beliefs, from Oxford University Press, 2002.
Now, we know many of the Norse literature works include mead references, and it was very closely tied to their pantheon and religious rituals.
Yep.
It was believed to be elevated and near divine.
But I'm going to ruin the myth for everyone right now and tell you something. Vikings and the Norse drank more beer and wine than they did mead.
Yeah.
Mead was expensive to make.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the reason why it was so elevated.
Yep. It was a special occasion, or for the wealthy kings, stuff like that. It was not that common. And you might have seen more like what we would call a hydromel today, something very light, a little more common because it uses less honey. But the really good stuff, like, things that we would consider like the Polish meads and sack meads of today, those are really rare for celebrations and for wealthy people. That they were not as... People were not walking around just drinking mead every day. It did not happen.
All right. So many times when you think of the Greeks and Romans, you think of wine,
Yep.
but they were drinking some fermented honey as well.
Yeah, they didn't have as much of it, but what they did is they also, it doesn't say that here, but they mixed wine and honey wine together. They made what we would call a piment today, or a lot of fruited type meads. It was common. And they would also sweeten things with honey pretty often. So it makes sense that they would be adding honey to their wines and things like that. They also didn't drink wine like we do today. Like today, you buy a bottle of wine or mead even, and you take that bottle, you pour it in a glass, and you drink it. Well, they didn't do that. They would take that bottle of wine, pour some of it into a glass or into another bottle, and usually dilute it up to 2/3 with water. So you might have 1 part wine to 2 parts water. And they did that so that they could drink more, not get drunk, and it made water more palatable. It wasn't really because water was bad. It was because they just didn't like the taste of it. So they added wine to it to make it taste better.
So for those of you who are familiar with the word hydromel, you can tell just by thinking a little bit about that word that has the root words coming from Greek and Roman language.
Yep.
So hydromeli was referenced in Roman text. Pliny the Elder.
From, I don't know what time period though, but it's BC. I know that. So it's over 2,000 years ago. But the reference for that is Pliny the Elder, Natural History Book 14, XIV actually, but it's book 14. The interesting thing about all of that though is hydromel. We call it that still today. And that was invented way back when, a couple thousand years ago. So that, I mean, all this stuff it's been around a long time.
Yep. Those dead languages aren't so dead, are they?
Yep.
Let's go back to Europe.
Medieval Europe, mead was often reserved for nobility and the clergy. Mead halls in Anglo-Saxon and Viking cultures as centers of community. They had a whole different way of doing things than we do today. Mead was also mentioned in Beowulf.
Yeah, that's one of the more common
But the whole mead hall thing, they called it a mead hall, but it was actually a gathering place. It was often a place where they would even have like small markets, like what we do for farmers markets on the weekends. They would do that at the mead hall or around the mead hall. They would have festivals and celebrations there. The officials would have their dinners and their meetings there. It was called a mead hall, but I think that's even a modern term. I don't think it was really called a mead hall back then. And even if it was, not as much mead was drank there as we would have thought.
They might have, we didn't study this, obviously, or research it, but it may have been termed the mead hall simply to give it some prominence and importance.
That's true, too. If mead was considered like a elevated thing, yep, that makes perfect sense. So they may have actually called it a mead hall.
All right, we are going to move forth now to the decline of mead.
Yeah.
And where did it go and why?
Well, beer and wine took over, basically, because they were cheaper, lots cheaper, and easier to produce in the volumes and quantities that were needed. Because you got to remember, this is, a long time ago when people weren't really raising bees like we do today. They were collecting honey that was occurring wildly, whereas they were already cultivating grapes, they were cultivating barley. So it was actually really easy to make wine and beer by that point.
Yeah, the rise of agriculture and proper irrigation systems really made the gathering of these ingredients much more easily readable to humans, where
honey was still not as scalable.
Was more rare. So it just ease and price tends to rule the world even today.
And then the sugar trade, that when that came along, that changed a lot because it was more portable. It was easier and cheaper to get almost anywhere in the world. And it just replaced honey in a lot of recipes. So right away, people started just gravitating to sugar rather than honey, which made it even more rare, more harder to get. And even today, honey costs many times what white sugar costs, just even still.
And then even with the history of beer, the addition of hops is actually newer in that time frame.
Yep.
And it really helped change the beer trade because it helped create a more stable beverage. And this is where the India Pale Ales came from, because
they couldn't make it around the Horn of Africa, so they had to add more hops to it to make it, because it's a natural antibiotic, so it would preserve the beer that much longer.
And so it made beer not only cheap, but more sustainable. And so it became more popular.
Though I would still think that like mead or honey could be transported too, but if it's not as common, then it's harder to do.
Right.
And
but if you have a
one
cheap
thing just leads to another.
And then you have a cheap thing that's lasting longer.
That's true. That's true.
That's giving it extra points.
Mead became associated with rural traditions and elitist luxury. And we all know the way society
It's like
works.
the dichotomy there.
Yeah. So it became a thing that some people would turn their nose up at because, oh, that's what the peasants do. And then other people thought, oh, well, I can't afford it because that's what the royals did. So I think it suffered from two different kinds of bad reputation depending on where you were. And that could definitely, I mean, we see it today.
Perception's reality.
Yeah. You know, who thinks MD 2020 is a good thing to buy, right? Just saying. I don't really have a problem with it, but I'm just using that as an example. We tend to like frown on certain brands or certain products just because that's the reputation.
So we're going to move to the mead renaissance. This is when mead is making its comeback, and that is recent history.
Yeah, 20th to 21st century, actually. I didn't think it was that old, but the homebrewing movement of the 1970s really started the resurgence of mead back into the limelight. And I can imagine why. I'm not even going to read some of the notes here. I can imagine why, and it's because of this. If you want to make wine, you got to have access to really good grapes, especially think 50 years ago. It was more complicated, okay? You couldn't just go to Amazon and order a grape concentrate. It didn't happen. At first, there was no Amazon. There's that. But it was much harder to get the products to do so. And the homebrew industry was just becoming legalized in all the states. So it was just becoming a thing where you could have access to some of the stuff that you need to be able to do it. People were doing it very crudely, very simply, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it was still a fledgling industry. So this is where mead stepped in, because beer, now you had to get the barley, you had to get the hops, you had to get yeast, you had to have the water chemicals right, and things like that. So people were making a lot of really crappy beer at home, and it wasn't taking off like they had hoped. But several years later, it totally took off. But wine was super hard to do at home unless you had access to grapes, which if you did, you were making country wines and things like that at home that were amazing if you had access to those things. But everybody could get honey.
Now, I didn't research this again because I was focused
I've researched this part.
On mead. But if you think about it, there were so many regulations of what you could and could not do, both in the wine and the beer sector, that when this new interest in homebrewing started around that time, I imagine that coincides with the new wineries popping up in California and creating their own brand of wine. So that way they weren't regulated to
the same way.
The narrow field of what could and could not be labeled things. They're just like, well, we'll just make our own thing. And then after that, I believe, because it's still going in California, they're still growing, became the big boom of the microbreweries. Where everybody's I think,
breaking the rules,
I think when
making your own stuff.
Most microbrewery people, that they started in their house. They started as homebrewers, and it just
took off.
They
went somewhere
and
with it.
Grew, and there was a huge boom of that. You couldn't.
Yeah, when we lived in St. Pete, there had to be at least 15 or 20 microbreweries.
Like every block had its own microbrewery, which was really awesome because there was so much variety and so many different things that you could sample and enjoy. There was something for everyone, even if you didn't really like beer that much.
An interesting side note about that, though, is the advent of so many microbreweries actually made homebrewing less popular.
Yep.
Because now you could go down the block, go within half a mile of your house, you might have 2 or 3 microbreweries. Why go through the trouble and the expense of doing it? Unless you're like us. We don't do it because it's cheaper. We don't do it because it's easier. We do it because we like making stuff. That's literally why we homebrew. I mean, just because we like doing it ourselves rather than having somebody else do it for us. I'd rather do it than pay for it. But that's just me.
So while those wineries and microbreweries were opening, so were craft meaderies worldwide. You got Moonlight Meadery, Superstition Meadery, Two Warriors.
Ken Schramm.
His
meadery.
Yep.
I forget the name of it. I think it's Schramm.
He really got people more interested into mead and mead making and what's available.
There's hundreds of meaderies now.
Yeah.
Hundreds of them.
With modern experimentation came with more varieties of mead, more ways to enjoy mead cocktails, carbonated mead, session meads. If you can ferment it or add it to something fermented, it's probably found its way in a mead.
Here's the thing. I think carbonation techniques are a little bit more of a modern thing because of the ability to seal things up. But I am a firm believer that way back in the day, barely anybody was drinking straight mead or like a traditional or a show mead. I don't think many people were really doing that. I think they were throwing anything they could think of into it. And here's partially why. Imagine if you make something that might be like you make a mead and maybe it got a little bit infected because you don't know much about oxidation and, wild yeast and all that. You just think your magic stick makes it ferment, right? I'm going back a lot. Like this is thousands of years ago before people knew what germs were, right? So you make something, it gets you drunk, but it doesn't taste real good. But you found this, patch of berries over here. So you might take some of those berries after you've eaten some, and maybe they're starting to look a little not so perfect anymore. You throw some of those into the mead and you go, hey, this makes it taste a lot better. So next time you go to make this mead or this wine or whatever it is, you might automatically put the fruit in there first. And people were putting all sorts of stuff, including meat, into mead. I don't know why, but they did. And all kinds of things. Then they put in herbs and spices, and it turned into almost a medicinal thing. They believed it carried medicinal properties, which in some cases it sort of did. But it's still alcohol. So it still had the problems of being alcohol, but if it had the right herbs and spices in it, it could actually have helped with certain different ailments and things like that. Kind of interesting.
So with these meaderies opening and the new technologies coming out, it made it much more accessible for you to just go to your local bar and say, give me some mead.
It's still not that common, though.
It's not. And then pop culture happened.
Oh, boy. Yep. Shows like Vikings, Game of Thrones, stuff like that. Is that what it says? Yeah, it does. And Ren fairs, Renaissance fairs. Those are another one. That is, I think, the 13th Warrior was the first time I think I'd ever really heard of mead.
It's made from honey.
That's not true. I'd heard of it, but I had no idea what it was. Like I thought of it like a grog kind of deal. I knew it was alcoholic, but I thought it was like this thick, almost porridge-like thing. And maybe at one time mead was that way, but that's not what they meant there. And all these shows, things like this, actually really sparked a whole new generation of interest into mead. And we saw it even on the City Setting Brews channel. Yeah. Game of Thrones had a season or two that was really big talking about mead. And we saw a huge revival in interest in mead making. And that's partially how we ended up being more mead makers than wine and cider makers, really. Yeah. We still are actually pretty equal on all three, but we're known for mead mostly because of Game of Thrones and Vikings TV show. Yep. It's kind of interesting how that works.
So now we're going to go into mead and literature, and we're going to have to read these so that way we're getting them right. But there are multiple references to mead, and I even found some suggestions of a honey-like beverage in the Bible.
Let's talk about Lord of the Rings for just a second. Elrond actually gave a beverage to, I believe it was Bilbo, but it doesn't actually say this. It says, "It is Mirivor, the cordial of Imladris. Elrond gave it to me at our parting," from The Lord of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien, while described as a cordial, Mirivor is also mentioned in Namori, a poem written in Elvish by J.R.R. Tolkien. A translation of the poem describes Mirivor as a mead. Now, I did a little bit of research on this a couple of times, and this is the one that I've been inspired to make, by the way. And I found that it's more than just mead. There's more to it. There's a couple of important ingredients that I'm not going to get into because, spoilers, we got to make the video on it. But we have some ideas on how we can do it and how it connects to The Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien and makes it make sense. And it's more like an honest recreation of it, because I've seen plenty of people that just took like vodka and added honey and a couple of ingredients and called it Mirivor. I'm like, I don't know. No, that's not what the elves would have done.
Right. When we try to make a fantasy-inspired brew, we actually try to ferment it to make it a brew, not a cocktail.
We also try to base it in some amount of fact that actually connects to the fantasy.
Yeah.
So we pull the facts from the fantasy to make the beverage.
Next up is Shakespeare.
I don't remember anything in Shakespeare about mead.
So William Shakespeare's works often reference mead, a drink that symbolizes wisdom, knowledge, and the passage of time.
See, that's a throwback to the Norse culture and Odin with mead.
Yeah. The even mead that erst brought sweetly forth and freckled cowslip, burnet and green clover, wanting the scythe, all uncorrected, rank conceives by idleness, and nothing teems but hateful docks, rough thistles, kexies, burrs, losing both beauty and utility. Sorry.
And this is why I don't read Shakespeare.
I almost got it through. It was the last word.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely saying mead. But I think you get thrown off by all the rest of the stuff that you go, what? One of the earliest mentions, though, is in Beowulf. And that's the Anglo-Saxon story based mainly in a great mead hall. Some people say that the 13th Warrior is loosely based off of, sort of, not completely, but kind of.
The 13th Warrior, the movie, I think is a collection of various stories. Yeah. Like the character that Antonio Banderas portrays was an actual
real guy.
Person of history.
Alim Fadim something.
But obviously some of the correlations and connections that they made in the movie was simply for
It's a movie.
The movie.
It's a movie. In Norse mythology, the history of mead is actually very bloody. I'm going to read this because the names are difficult and I can't remember them. The dwarves Bodin, Son, and Odrerer, I guess, murdered Kvasir and mixed his blood with honey, thus creating a mead which made anybody who drank it a poet or a scholar, also known as a skald. I've heard many different versions of the myth of the invention of mead. There was one where Odin stole it. There was the dwarves like this, but there was another one too where there was a giant. There's so many different versions of this that this is a new one for me, though, because they're very specific on the names.
I believe those dwarves are associated with the compass points. I might be mixing up, but I know that I did.
There was something like that. Yeah.
But this alludes to how lots of times a fermented honey beverage, mead or whatnot, is attributed to magical properties where they can bestow the consumer
quite often
with a gift. So in this instance, it's the gift of poetry. So they become musically inclined.
And that was why Odin became so wise too. He gave up his eye and he started drinking a lot of mead. I'm not even kidding. That's one of the stories. There's a lot of different stories about that, but that's where it is. There are lots of literature based on Norse mythology, and it actually inspired J.R.R. Tolkien with a lot of his stuff, including The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And that's where like dwarves come from, and the elves come from, and the fae come from, things like that, is from Norse mythology. They had fairies, they had elves, they had dwarves, and it's interesting because dwarves were not actually considered short people. There was something else about dwarves. I forget exactly what it was, but they were kept separate from the regular people. They were dwarves, as we would know, like a short person as we would know them today. But they were also considered almost like a different race.
Yeah,
I read something about that a while ago, and I'm just trying to recall some of it. But they were treated better Like they were kept away, though. It was really interesting. They were like oracles and seers and things like that. They alluded to some of that in the 13th Warrior, as a matter of fact, but that was a real thing that the Norse did.
Now, when we are quoting different things, many modern people may just assume it's the movie. Lots of these quotes are actually from the original books that those movies are based on.
Yeah.
You did know that, right? They were books first.
Yeah.
Okay. So for The Hobbit, they sat long at the table with their wooden drinking bowls filled with mead. Like the quotes from Game of Thrones, I'm pretty sure it was from the books, not from the thematic adaptations. So a horn of mead was never far from his hand.
Yeah, I could believe that from Game of Thrones. Yeah. Game of Thrones used mead a lot. Yeah. It was pretty common. And Sansa Stark taking the vow of service from Brienne of Tarth. I vow that you shall always have a place by my hearth and meat and mead at my table, and pledge to ask no service of you that might bring you into dishonor. I swear it by the gods and the new. Arise. By the way, if anybody hadn't seen that far into Game of Thrones yet, I apologize for the spoilers.
Spoilers. So Neil Gaiman takes inspiration from Norse mythology as well, and included it in his tome American Gods.
I never read that. You're a big Neil Gaiman fan.
Yeah, we have the book in our library.
All right, well, if I can get it on Kindle.
Like mead, he chuckled, it's a drink, concentrated prayer and belief distilled into a potent liqueur.
Except that it's not distilled.
Yeah,
It's not distilled.
Okay, this is a quote. It's talking about concentrated prayer and belief.
Yeah, I get it. I know. Yeah. I know. The 10th century Book of Exeter is an amazing anthology of Anglo-Saxon texts. They were very keen on riddles and kennings, of which riddle 27 is about mead. Elegy 27 is about wandering among Roman ruins in England. I'll read them. Bright were the city buildings, many bathhouses, many mead halls filled with the joys of men, until mighty fate changed all that. From Wales, we have the Gododin, a medieval poem by Aneurin around 1250. So this is only like 1,000 years ago. Yeah. The men went into Catraeth. They were renowned. Wine and mead from golden cups was their beverage. So it's been mentioned a lot. And this is a medieval poem. So it's not necessarily fantasy. It's not necessarily mythology. They were writing about things that they knew.
Yeah, we have so many. We have Chaucer. Yeah. We have the Song to Mead. We have Shakespeare.
We literally have an entire page of these, so we can just copy and paste them into the description if you want to read through those. Otherwise, it'll take us another half an hour to get through them all, and I, for one, don't really want to have to read them all.
Okay, so whether it's an ancient Chinese tomb, a Viking longhouse, your local craft bar, or wherever you can find mead, it's been there as long as human history has.
Actually, yeah, it was there before us. And you know what? It'll probably be there after us too, as long as the bees survive. If you enjoyed today's episode, give us a thumbs up and a like, share it with your friends, tell everyone, shout it from the rooftops that the Ferment Station made a new episode about mead. That's not even in the notes. I just made that up on the fly.
Also, if you have a topic that you'd like us to discuss, let us know in the comments below.
And as always, guys, thanks so much for listening and have a great day.
Bye-bye.